All right. Everybody give a round of applause, thumbs up, wave your hands for Qymana Botts, who is no longer the co-host. We'll get this. A co-host. Now your co-host.
Hello.
We'll trim this. No, we won't.
No, make some more organic. It's fine. It's good. Hi. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for showing up to this presentation. I'm Qymana Botts, and this is documentation: the why, the how, the do it now. You can find me on Twitter at Qymana on a quest. So what we're going to talk about today on our trip through the magical land of documentation, and also excuse me if you're looking at any video, my notes are down here. But this is going to be our agenda for today. First, we're going to go through some quick introductions. Then I'm going to give an overview about why documentation is important and all that jazz. After that, I'm going to get into exactly what documentation is and what makes it good or bad. And then we'll talk about what goes into your documentation. And then I'm going to talk about certain arguments that you might encounter when trying to push forward the agenda of getting your team on board for documentation. And then I'll leave you with some resources and final thoughts. So I'm Qymana Botts. Hello, my pronouns are she, her. I'm a software engineer at Nerdery in Chicago, although I'm located in Indiana. Fun fact about me, I had a whirly ball and laser tag wedding reception with ripped my wedding dress, and that was real good. Everyone was really tired at the end of it. It was terrific. I am currently working on a board game based on my 2 dogs and my very no-nonsense rabbit. So I have a tiny little co-presenter who is very loud and yippy on my lap right now. He's very annoying. So I'm trying to keep him from barking during this. So if he pops his little head up, then that's Humphrey. And my default mood is aggressively grateful. I'm just real happy to be here all the time. Just existing is wonderful, even in times like this, because I get to, chat with all you terrific folks. And it's just, I'm just happy. I'm happy to be here. So a little bit about the company I work for. It's pretty swell. It's called Nerdery. We're based in Minnesota, but we have offices in Chicago and Phoenix, as well as lots of remote people. We take companies from today into their digital future, working at the leading edge of strategy, design, and technology to help our clients evolve and thrive. So yeah, it's a pretty great company, really supportive during this time. I really love it there. So yeah, let's get into it. We are going to talk about documentation, blah, 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 air horns. So first, what is documentation? Documentation can take many forms. It can be a lot of different things. You can do code comments. It can be stuff in a wiki. Some people make the argument that the code that you write and APIs that you write are forms of documentation in and of themselves. But the purpose of documentation is to provide information about how something functions in the context around why a thing was built a certain way. So types of documentation. It can vary significantly depending on audience goals and context. The same feature will likely have vast differences from relevant code, tickets, and tutorials. So you can document the same feature, but depending on who the target audience is, what the purpose of that particular documentation is, the documentation can look very different. It can look like comments in your code. It can look like requirements spelled out on a ticket as to like how something is supposed to function. It can look like writing a user guide for end users to be able to like operate the functionality. But it's one feature can just like have various types of like different documentation around it. For the purposes of this discussion, we're going to be talking about we're going to be talking about how docs and why docs. So when I say how docs, basically how docs are is documentation that provides information about like how something operates, or information about like, yeah, how something operates in the way a thing is being done. Why docs provide context behind why something was implemented in a certain way, or it provides context about the decisions that may not be apparent in just like the code or just the operational aspect of it. So now we are going to talk about the 5 W's of documentation. So who should be writing documentation? The short answer is everybody should be writing documentation. The longer answer is that documentation is everybody's job, and it shouldn't be left up to the person with like the fanciest technical background, or your project manager, or whoever. It's everyone's job to contribute to the process of documenting code and like the functionality of your code base. Even if it's not just code, there are many different things, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that you can document. And so it doesn't matter like where you fall in like the hierarchy, or like where you fall on the ladder. There is something to contribute from your unique perspective. A junior developer that is going through an environment setup, for example, might encounter things that a senior developer may know how to fix just by rote because they've done it so many times. But it doesn't mean that like those issues shouldn't be documented. And it's something that like someone that is very, very proficient might not even think about a step. So having a variety of people contributing to documentation helps you identify weak spots in your documentation and make sure things are explicit and understandable. If you do something that something that someone else is likely to do later on, you should write it down. It doesn't need to be like the greatest technical detail. In fact, you want to write as little documentation as possible. You just want to have the bare minimum to like get the idea across in a way that communicates a complete idea. But it doesn't need to be like the most technical detail that can contribute to things going stale and stuff like that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So what should you document? When I look at documentation, I tend to start by asking these questions. So the first question is, what knowledge is needed for me to do my job day to day? So like, what do I need to know how to do every single day? I like in my personal like day to day, I need to know like how to do Git, and I need to know like how to get my databases for my local environment. I need to know where the like testing environments and production environment, like I need to know what the environments for the project that I'm working on are. I need to know like where is my repo? Like there are a bunch of things that I need to know that are just like kind of basic things. I need to know how like configuration is managed and things like that are just like day to day things that like once you've been on a project or once you've been doing something for a while, it's just kind of like automatic and rote. Those are the kinds of things where you can start looking at documenting. Second question is, what does your team need to know to function effectively? So what's what are some areas that there needs to be like a consistent way of people doing something? Our project like is not going to function as smoothly as possible if everyone has a different Git workflow. If people don't have like a solid understanding of how tickets move through Jira or things like that. So what do you need to know? Like, what does your team need to know? And also kind of implied in this is like agree upon what sorts of processes and things do you need to know for your team to be able to like work effectively together and work collaboratively? And then what are some areas of friction or ambiguity in my workflow? So any areas that like you find being like a time suck or being, you have to ask yourself questions or consistently have to like dig to find answers in your workflow. Any areas that seem like there's like kind of a hiccup, that can be an area where you can start to document and kind of iron out and define those areas of friction and ambiguity so that things are a bit more clearly and you can work a bit more efficiently. So to give a few examples, some technical things that you can document, things like environment setup, Git workflow, custom code implementation. If you have a custom module, for example, being able to put the to document the functionality of that module and also like how you're supposed to use it, and also the reasoning behind like why is this custom code existing, like what purpose is this supposed to serve, and then also like your development workflow, things like that. Are you pulling in fresh databases every day? Looks like, okay, oh sorry. So yeah, are you pulling in fresh databases every day? Are there scripts that you run? Is there things like that? And some non-technical things like ticket workflow, points of contact for your team, team norms. What are your expectations for communication? Do we email? Do we Slack? Do we leave comments on tickets? Like, how do we communicate? Things like that. Role expectations and internal processes. Next question, where should my documentation go? Short answer is where people can find it. The long answer is it depends. What are you documenting? Ideally, the thing that your documentation should live as close to the thing that you are documenting as possible. Now, when it comes to writing for different audiences, it doesn't make sense, for example, to put things like requirements or certain like how-to documentation that's meant for like a non-technical user in your README on your code base. It doesn't make sense for that. So you want to put it in a place that's discoverable to the audience that it's targeting. So if you're documenting code, this could mean leaving code comments, but it also could mean fleshing out your README or adding some things within your code base that people are going to be able to reference. And then also, again, like for non-technical users or other stakeholders, what tools are they using and where are they spending a lot of their time? So for example, we use Confluence and Jira. So a lot of things are documented in tickets and also just in like articles and like pages in our Confluence, so that those non-technical stakeholders that are not necessarily in our organization can like have visibility into that stuff. When should I write documentation? Now, you should get in the habit of documenting your work as you're doing it. As you get more and more into the habit of documenting your work, it becomes easier to maintain, and also it becomes, you get much better and more efficient at it. If you document something immediately after you've implemented it, for example, or you've completed a task, it's both fresh in your head and usually like your environment is already set up if you need to do screenshots and stuff. So if I am documenting errors that I encounter in environment setup, Well, my terminal is right there. I can just take screen caps of those errors and like either screen cap them and then like the commands that I use to resolve them, or dump errors into a Word document and stuff so that I can put them in our documentation later. Why write documentation? Having good documentation makes you more efficient and improves your workflow as both a team and an individual. It improves communication with your team, and it challenges everyone to have a better understanding of the work that they're doing. Also, it provides an opportunity to gain a better understanding of the platform. It also helps mitigate areas of ambiguity and minimize assumptions that people might be making. So if everyone is assuming, for example, that a data, like a content type, for example, is going to be structured one way, and they all have different, like the front-end developer has a different assumption than the back-end developer, and so working off of their different assumptions, they end up coming to an implementation that doesn't like quite mesh. Documenting these things helps minimize those assumptions and areas of ambiguity. And it raises something called the bus factor. Now, the bus factor is how many people on your team would have to get hit by a bus before your project goes up in flames. It's kind of morbid. You could think of it as the lotto factor, like how many people on your team have to win the lotto and just like bounce and be like, I'm out before your team goes up in flames. Or you lose key information. Documentation is essential in knowledge sharing and making sure that you don't have any like just like areas of like siloed off knowledge where one person is the keeper of all of the information and you're highly dependent on that one person. And if they are not able to like delve out that knowledge, then you are in trouble on your project. So now that we've talked about the who, what, where, and why of documentation, let's talk about how to write good documentation. Good documentation is concise, simple, and navigable. Navigable, so it's short. It is concise such that you are only documenting what is necessary to be documented. It doesn't have to be, again, in like the greatest level of detail. You're communicating the main information. It is simple, so there's not like these ridiculous or overly complicated charts or things like that. It's easy to understand and digest by looking at it, and it's navigable. And by navigable, I mean you can find what you're looking for. So like this is also like discoverable, and also you can like navigate through the documentation and like know where you are. You're not going to get lost in like this sea of like words and like nested pages and things like that. So some tips on writing good documentation: you want to decouple how docs and why docs. So how docs are likely to change, right? They are the things like that tell you how something works, and as your platform or the thing that you're documenting grows and changes and evolves, they're more likely to go stale than the why, right? The why docs are significantly like more geared towards reasoning behind a certain implementation. They're more geared towards taking certain approaches to things. They talk about like how things may have been structured. So like maybe you chose to approach something one way because of the way like an API is sending data back. So those kinds of things, like the why docs, the reasoning behind certain implementations or things like that, can be decoupled a bit from the how docs, which are likely to change. Next thing is don't over document. You want to prioritize like good quality, clear, concise documentation over just like documenting all the things, because that's how things get lost and go stale. If you have too much documentation, then you have all of this stuff that you need to maintain. And that's a problem, because if you are spending like more time maintaining your documentation than is valuable for your team, then it significantly decreases the value of the documentation. And then also just, again, keep them where they can be easily found. Put the documentation where the audience is going to find it. So when I go about writing documentation, the main thing I typically do is the rubber duck approach. So I like to talk through the thing that I'm documenting and write down what I say, or I always use like text to speech or voice recording to do this, just because it's just, it kind of removes one of these steps. So you're talking through a thing and just capturing what you're saying. For Windows users, there's a tool in the resources, and I forget what it's called, but I'll point it out, that you can go through it. I think it's called the steps recorder. And basically it will follow your cursor and like basically like narrate or like transcribe the actions that you're doing with your computer. Basically, it's super cool. There's not an equivalent thing on Mac that I've seen, but it's a thing on Windows. So yeah, but yeah, talking through a problem, and that way you can figure out holes where like, oh, maybe you need to go a little bit more in depth in this particular step. And then there's the API approach. So you want to document everything that's publicly accessible in an API. So if you have public classes and functions and things like that, you want to make sure that they are well documented, and that people that they are documented in a way that someone can understand them. So a little kind of quick formula is a description of the thing, and then you can provide an example, and then like make sure to call out any edge cases that exist. And then get feedback. Cunningham's law is the best way to get the right answer on the internet is not to ask a question, it's to post the wrong answer. And this is super helpful in this conversation, because let's say you're documenting a process that you have on your team. Sometimes it's easier for people to point at something and say, this is not right, than it is for them to be like, this is the correct thing. So having a draft or a concrete thing that people can point to and be like, hey, actually this point isn't right, it should be this, might be more effective than being like, hey team, let's talk through our process and document our process. You might get more, you'll get more interaction and feedback by having people like needing to correct the wrong thing. So that brings us to getting people on board for documentation. So everyone pretty much knows that documentation is like super important, and that everyone should be prioritizing it to some degree. But like realistically, what tends to happen is that things that provide like a monetary or like concrete value tend to get pushed up the list, and documentation is pushed down the list. So convincing people to start adopting a pattern of like documenting their work and like having that like clear, concise documentation is probably just communicating the value of it in a way that is concrete. And sometimes the best way to just do this is just to start documenting things. One thing that I found somewhat recently is documenting certain like environment setup steps that weren't clearly documented somewhere. It was just a couple of steps, but they weren't really written down anywhere. I had to ask a person to do it for those steps. So I just went through, and when I set up the environment for this thing I was working on, I just took a couple of screenshots and like copied down all of my commands that I put in my terminal and just like threw it on our Confluence. And then a couple days later, our front-end developer had to set up the same environment. And so rather than having to like walk him through how to set up the environment and like any of those quirks, there was already like a page that I had just dumped all my information into. So it's like, here are the steps that I took. Here are some of the things that I encountered and how I fixed them. And if you have any experience outside of this, like go ahead and ask me and I'll see if I have an answer for you. And also, yeah, just doing that. So like it kind of paid off like almost immediately. But yeah, it's sometimes just like important to just start doing it, and then people will see the value, hopefully. So if people say, well, we can't documentation is worthless because it goes stale too quickly, then you might be documenting the wrong things. Focus on documenting things that are immutable or unlikely to change. And this can be things like your internal processes, and again, like focusing on why docs rather than how docs. If they say, oh, I didn't become a developer to write words, I want to write code. You can say, writing documentation helps you focus on the code that you're writing by helping to eliminate confusion about the code that you wrote. It's going to stop you from writing code if every 10 minutes someone's asking you, hey, so about this thing in the code base, can you explain this to me? Or like, where do I find this thing? If you think about the process that it might take to, so let's say you're setting up an environment and you have steps A, B, C, and D. And so you have to you're going through the steps, you get through A and B, and then you encounter an error. So then you have to put a message in Slack, wait for someone to see your message, they have to respond to your message, so you're constantly checking Slack to see if someone has responded to your message. Then you take whatever solution that they've provided, and then you apply it to your situation, and then if it works, then you respond to them and say that you fixed the thing, and then you continue going on. For things that problems that people have already solved, it's so much easier to just have the documentation there, so that way you're not interrupting. You have these different streams of work going, and you're pulling billable resources off of something that they could be continuing to bill on, because nobody wrote down that to fix this error that everyone encountered on their environment setup, you just do boop-de-boop and then it's fixed. It's just, it helps to mitigate that that layer of context switching, and helps people stay focused on the task at hand. Taking time to write documentation is expensive. Context switching and repeating yourself and dealing with blockers and fixing preventable mistakes, and also refixing things that you've already solved are all they're all expensive, and arguably more expensive than writing good documentation. All of those problems can be mitigated with writing good documentation. And here's some final thoughts. Simple, concise, accessible documentation can make the difference between hours of headaches and a smoother, more efficient working experience. It is an investment that yields returns in every aspect of the development process. Do it now, and the future you will be glad that you did. So that is my presentation. Here are some articles that I used as reference for this. Really, really great reads. Problem Steps Recorder is that Windows tool that will help you that'll help you record the steps of the process that you're using. But yeah, that's it. Thank you. I was gonna do an April Fool's joke and I just didn't have the energy. So April Fool's, I don't know.
Take everybody off of mute at the same time now, so we can give a big round of applause. So everybody ready? Unmute and all. Yeah, great job, come on.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna mute everybody again just for convenience sake here. And what questions do we have? Let's use the, you know what, there's not that many of us. I'm just gonna mute everybody again. or no, I'm going to change it to allow participants to unmute themselves. So yes, now feel free. I want to mute everybody again. Yes. Okay. Now everybody's muted again. Now you can unmute yourself and ask a question. So.
It's not a question, but it's more a comment here. I truly agree 1000% that everyone needs to be documenting, because more often than not, I see it a lot when they don't, and inevitably we end up, somebody ends up leaving, transitioning off, and you lose a lot of that institutional knowledge when you don't have someone documenting, because everyone knows they're supposed to be documenting, but there's no one really looking over saying, like, have you documented that? When there's not like that one person being annoying and nagging in the background, that's when it just doesn't get done a lot of times. And then everyone just seems to suffer at the end, right? The projects too, and anything moving forward, any work moving forward. So it's a big call out,
I have a comment too. The last couple of years, I've been doing work that had FDA and Medicare and Medicaid oversight. And I have to say that you have to be cognizant of the contractual and regulatory regulations over documentation. And I will say that most of my documentation as a developer was done before I wrote a line of code, because we had development reviews before we actually wrote code. We had code reviews that code actually helped keep in mind of what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes if you write documentation after you write the code, it's real easy to skip over some of the reasons or whys of why you did something. Where if you do it ahead of time, you don't miss that, and the people who are reviewing it don't miss it. And when the auditors and the regulators come in, you have to have it, or else you can be put out of business with severe fines. So I just say you got to be cognizant of regulatory and contractual requirements for documentation.
So I want to say that I really liked Qymana's ideas about the text-to-speech thing, and some of those little shortcuts that she said about being able to get the documentation down without taking a lot of time to do it. Copying some of your basic steps as you're doing the actual work, doing that dump. The Cunningham's Law piece was really good, because if you run into a problem and you document what that was, and you're looking for the answer out there on the internet, it's a lot easier to do that. So those were really good thoughts. And I'm glad you put a list of best sources out there that you have. Do you have some ideas or some suggestions on formatting, what the best way for this documentation to be put together would be? Kind of a template that you've used?
So as far as like, it's going to feel like a really like cop-out answer, but it really just depends on like your workflow and like what information you need. It like knowing your own process and knowing the things that you tend to look for is going to help you write the documentation that's going to best apply to your situation. I will say that like for me, we do a lot of like, I tend to write a lot of stuff in like Markdown. The Drupal issue queue, like Dredditor template is super great, at least for like tickets, but like also breaking down like what is the motivation or the problem that you're trying to solve with the documentation, and then like adding information like that. I really like the Dredditor template because it helps me it helps me have a clear idea of like what I am trying to, like what question am I even trying to answer? Like, why am I writing this documentation? And then once I have a clear idea of that, then I can kind of outline what is like necessary from that point, if that like makes any sense. So short answer is that like it depends on like the questions, the information that you consistently need to like ask yourself, or that you're consistently looking for. Long answer is, or I guess that's the long answer. The short answer is I really like problem / motivation, and then answering that question below. Whether that's like in ticket form, because the Dredditor like format, like with the issue queue and stuff, is like very much like an actionable kind of situation where there are steps that you need to take, and there's like a problem and stuff that you're like outlining and stuff. But I don't know, I find that like just asking myself what is the problem or the motivation behind what I am writing right now is helpful in whatever case I'm working in.
I want to add something to what Qymana just said. I like the Dredditor template too for my tickets, but also be mindful of where you store your documentation and what the people are using the documentation for, because some things like Google Docs, if people want to copy and paste, it pastes all kinds of weird formatting in. So be mindful of the things that kind of change the format when you copy and paste.
Very, very true, Amy June.
Yeah, totally.
I want to also just say it's not all writing. This is Andy. That video. So a lot of things that we've done is when like demos for clients is we'll record the demo of showing them how to build and take care of their site and call that documentation. And I've written a little bit more that kind of saves some of the screenshotting that needs to be done. But then I'll say fast forward to minute 20 of the demo to see how to assemble like hero components and whatever. So video is also a great way to document and have audio over top of that.
Also, another thing, Dwayne had a really, really great presentation a couple months ago on the tours module. And I don't know if that's recorded anywhere, but it was like real good. Sweet. But yeah, like, again, having documentation in a place that people are going to be able to find it and in a format that is best going to communicate the information is going to be like super, like whatever streamlines it and makes you be able to put it in front of someone's face is going to be whatever, like it's going to be the best, and that's going to be different for every scenario.
I have a question that it kind of relates to answers you've given, but where do you find the balance with, oh yes, we need to create documentation and we need to document all the things? How do we, I guess, how do we not over document? Do you have tips for that or advice?
Yeah, so again, at least personally, I always start with those 3 questions. So what is absolutely essential for a person to know to be able to like interact with this thing that I'm documenting, right? Like what is absolutely essential? And then from there, there's like the collaborative thing with the teams, but then also like what do people keep getting tripped up on? Because those are the areas where if you are trying to document everything and those areas aren't addressed first, then you're going to, like those are clearly, if you're running into places of friction or ambiguity, then those are areas where like that need to be addressed, right? Like those are the places where people are like losing time or like things keep happening. So I guess when it comes to balancing document all the things and like document the important things. There's like, I would say, ask yourself, are we running into an issue with this thing? Like, is this a thing that's like causing conflict or friction? Is this essential knowledge? And then if the answer to those questions are no, then I would ask what is essential about, like, what is essential to know about this unit of work that I'm working on. For a person that like might be ramping up on a project, like what is essential about this nugget, and just do like the bare minimum. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
All right, I think just for the sake of timing on the video, we're going to go ahead and stop the recording here.